And
Heather's coming.
And Heather's here now.
Oh, okay.
Catherine, you said, yeah.
Hi, Dave.
Hello, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Good.
Awesome.
I want to be really sensitive and efficient. That Friday afternoon, people are making time. I know it's a tired time of the week for everybody. Hi, Amanda. Does everybody know everybody, or do we need to do some intros? Everybody knows Catherine?
Yeah.
Yeah, we all know each other.
Okay. And again, this is everybody as far as we know?
I believe so. Unless, Amanda, did you invite anyone?
Just Wanda and Catherine.
Okay.
Yeah, and I invited Steve, but he couldn't make it. So Steve, social worker.
And Shannon wasn't sure she'd be able to make it either.
Okay. All right. Well, let's start. And if people have the link, I'll keep an eye on things to see if they come on in. So this is the findings meeting. We've done these lots. Some people have sat in on them. Some have not. It's a longer meeting than typical because there's usually a lot of things to talk about. And my intention and my hope is that we make this as conversational as possible. And I will take it as part of my responsibility to get as many, if not all, everybody's voice in the room during the 90 minutes that we have. The real focus in the findings meeting is findings and recommendations. And so I have a number of those. And I always like to say at the beginning, because it's almost always true, that I know the student least of anybody. I think that's true on this team. So primarily what I'm going to be speaking to is what I heard from you. I met Ryan, which was really incredibly pleasant. He's wonderful, charming, fun kid to hang out with for an hour and a half, couple hours. But mostly what I know is I know it through what you told me and what I read, what the school and what Amanda provided. So I'm going to talk a bit about a bunch of different things, and I want you to stop me at any point. Does that work for folks? We'll do a hard stop at 4:30, just to be sensitive to everybody's time. I want to frame out a couple things I want to say from the outset as a kind of a preface in talking about Ryan, that he's a wonderful kid. He's a complicated kid. There is almost always significant complications when a kid has the kind of early trauma exposure as Ryan had. But I want to say something because this will invariably come up. It would be, in my opinion, an exercise in speculation to decide which of Ryan's challenges are associated with developmental delays, trauma, and now it has been possibly the diagnosis of ASD. He is not, as far as I know, and I talked with his psychiatrist today, he's not currently diagnosed with an autism spectrum disorder. He has not been formally diagnosed. The only thing I could find in the records was early CDC report or CHC reports saying that they thought he did not have autism. So that, I think, Amanda, is an open question as of today, not a decided question.
The conversation that I had with Marga was that most likely it is autism spectrum. It wasn't definitive because there is not anyone that will test him or could test him at this point. But when Marga and I went through the DSM briefly and talked about him, she was clear with me, or fairly clear with me, that most likely he is on the spectrum.
Okay. Part of it's relevant for a couple of reasons that you and I talked about and that the educators certainly know about is that in terms of both access and services, particularly as he ages, having an accurate set of diagnoses often drives certain decisions in the mental health and developmental services world. So I do think a kid his age with some of his other challenges and strengths could be assessed. I do know from talking with the psychiatrist that they don't do the ADOS and the ADI, which are the kind of state-of-the-art tools. So I think that that's an open question of whether I'm not familiar with people just by interview diagnosing a kid with autism. It's not my experience of the way it typically works in Vermont and in best practice.
No, it's not. Like I said, it was a conversation with Marga, and it's something that we're investigating. But the problem is because there's a limited amount of resources in this state, that it's very difficult to get him in anywheres to actually have an actual diagnosis at this point. But it is something that Marga and I have talked about that we will be pursuing.
Okay. So even if he were diagnosed on the spectrum, I would still say the same thing, that connecting any particular behavior, any particular challenge to a particular of the life experiences, developmental disorder, complex or developmental trauma, or on the spectrum, it would still be, to me, an act of speculation to say it's a this, it's a that. And that fortunately, as complicated as that makes things, that these three frameworks, diagnostic criteria, categories might be in play, that the fortunate thing is that there's lots of overlap between those three areas. Not complete overlap, there's some uniquenesses in each one of them, but there's enough overlap that there are students like that in Vermont that are very appropriately educated, both in school and very appropriately provided mental health services. So does that make sense for folks? I'm going to offer a metaphor. It is like metaphors. It is applicable, I think, to Ryan and not an exact fit. And so Beth's heard this before because she and I've worked in particular ways around this. Well, one way to think about some of the challenges related to trauma, which is that since that is my particular area of expertise, I have to both discipline myself to not see everything that is worrisome about Ryan through the lens of trauma, because again, I just said it's not. It's more complicated than that. If I were to suspend that for a second and just talk as somebody that has some level of expertise around trauma, I would say the following, that it is fairly common for kids that have had 3 to 4 years or less sometimes of prolonged exposure to trauma in the first 3 or 4 years of their lives. It's fairly common for them to have two operating systems. So the metaphor I'm gonna use is gonna compare Ryan or a child, a young adult like him, to a computer. The operating system, so the two operating systems, operating system number one would be the operating system that he developed in the first 4 years of life, that is very much focused on survival. I'm not disputing that there must have been some okay times when he was with his birth family. The preponderance of evidence suggests that it was a pretty significantly and consistently stressful experience for him and his siblings for those 4 years. So one of the things we know about kids in those kinds of conditions is they develop a certain way of understanding the world. They develop a certain way of inviting people into that world. Sometimes in mental health we call that reenactment. That sometimes if you have been accustomed to being harmed and hurt in a certain way, that unless there's direct intervention in that, you continue to expect and therefore provoke people to treat you in a way that you came to see as normative and expected. I think that Ryan does that sometimes. And I think Amanda helped me because she actually named that there are times that kids that have been hurt and abandoned at the hands of adults will create certain feelings in adults to test out whether you're going to treat me in the way that I was most familiar to be treated in those disproportionately impactful first 4 years of life. So operating system number one represents what governs a youngster's behavior based on their early life experience. And then operating system number two is the one that developed since he's lived with Amanda. That's an operating system that's very different because it's based on kindness and love and regard and consistency and structure and routine and playfulness and fun and all those kinds of things. I think what determines which operating system is primarily in charge of Ryan is about the stress level that he's experiencing at a particular moment. When his stress level is reasonably moderated, I think he follows the Amanda Dickerson operating system. I think when he's distressed and he's worried and he's anxious, I think he time travels and he's governed much more by the rules of engagement that are based on survival. And that's when he'll say unkind things, do unkind things, be grabby, look selfish, look like it's, I'm just going to do what I'm going to do, which is good for me. Does that metaphor work, or did I miss on that? Yeah, that makes sense.
Sounds right
So
to me.
yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
I said it just sounds right to me.
So one way of looking at him is if he's having a hard time, he's being governed by the rules of engagement that Amanda has not taught him, that has worked really hard in the last 10 years to shift, and has in many ways, a lot of ways, on a lot of days, been consistently successful around that. He has recovered, in my view, he's recovered to some degree from his developmental trauma exposure, not completely, but certainly more than a lot of kids that I've worked with that even have more cognitive capacity. Third thing, so first is that, is the notion of speculation, like there's a lot going on for this youngster. The second is the metaphor. The third thing that I said is, fortunately there's an overlap when it comes to what are the best practices in terms of raising and educating and providing mental health. And then I want to remind what I think most of you know, I know some of you for years and some of you just getting to know you, that one of the lenses that we find ourselves most attracted to in the work that I do and we do is to think about early trauma as essentially a physiological and relational issue. That on the most basic level, those 4+ years of trauma exposure impacted Ryan's central nervous system. And you can see it. I mean, watch him, you spend any time with him, and you can just feel the way that his central nervous system, the fear, the fastness, he's not a kid that goes 0 to 60 very fast. He's a kid that goes 40 to 60 really fast. That expression 0 to 60 implies that he knows what 0 is like, and I don't think that he really spends a lot of time knowing what full calm feels like in his body. So it's not accurate to say he's 0 to 60. He's 40 to 60. He still lives life in somewhat of a jacked up, hyper-vigilant way. And then the fifth thing I want to say, as a matter of introduction, then again, stop me at any time, is I just want to name maybe 5 or 7 general best practice guidelines in working with a kid. Even if we were just talking about developmental trauma, I'd be saying the same thing. The first one, and perhaps the most important one, it's the same thing I say to parents if they're co-parenting a kid that has a trauma history, but I extend the notion beyond just because Ryan has one primary caregiver, not 2 or 3 or 4. He's got one primary caregiver, that's Amanda. But I'll extend what I'm saying that I would usually say to parents, because it is also relevant to the treatment team, and that is, if I were to pick the most important treatment criteria or treatment framework, it would be alignment between parents and professionals. That if there isn't hard work, which I know there has been, if there's not a lockstep, ultimately who suffers is Ryan and not us as adults in the same way. And again, Amanda, I don't want to minimize the pain that that you have felt at times, or the school, the pain that you have felt at times. The alignment is that critical to Ryan's overall mental health and developmental, him being able to achieve at his fullest. I will also say, and I don't say this, I hope, challenge me on this, I don't say this to let any one of you off the hook or myself, but it is such a common experience. Trauma is such an insidious, impactful thing that trauma that is often experienced by an individual student often finds its way within the operating system of a treatment team. That is the power of the contingency of trauma. And that often some of the things that happen between members of a treatment team are the things that happen between Ryan and individual adults. That's how powerful it can embed itself in systems, organizations. So I don't say that, I hope, to let anybody off the hook. I just say that because if there has been, and there has been, some tension between home and school, some of that maybe one of you individually has to own, but I also want to at least have you recognize that that is such a common experience amongst teams of people. And Catherine, maybe you could speak to that because you're on lots of different teams and lots of different schools. it is often a common element in teams where they're working with a kid that's had very profound trauma exposure. Go ahead, Catherine.
So I just ditto my experience anecdotally in the field through the years is exactly what you're saying, Dave. And it made me also think of, and maybe you can help maybe make the connections too, but I feel like my experience with that is that it's just like I've seen it within families with kiddos of trauma. It's very common for families to experience vicarious or secondary trauma, not only with the parents, but, just all the other household members, the whole family as a system. And I feel like it's similar with the teens too. How it can infiltrate in that way. It's this vicarious thing that spreads out. And if we're not mindful in our awareness and being attuned to the signs of vicarious trauma, then that's where it embeds itself and becomes more toxic and getting in the way as a barrier of the real goal of treatment.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I would say, in addition, that if you were to think about trauma for a second as an externalized, like think about it as having its own shape and form, it is very much in trauma's agenda to create divisiveness, to create lack of integration, because that makes trauma stronger. So if you thought about trauma as an entity, I'm thinking like Star Trek stuff. If you thought about trauma as an entity, it is in trauma's interest to divide people, because then trauma gets stronger. The symptoms of trauma, the expression of trauma. Does that work for folks, that notion? Yeah. It is also known by many of you that trauma symptomizes through behaviors, but behaviors are not the issue. That doesn't mean that Ryan's behaviors are not worrisome and problematic. They are. It's just that if you take an overly behavioral approach, you end up missing the forest for the trees. That almost every problematic behavior that Ryan participates in is because in that moment he's in some kind of psychological, emotional, relational pain. And that what we're seeing is an expression of pain, even though it can be annoying and bothersome and redundant and at times threatening and worrisome. So I don't want to minimize the impact of the behavior. The behavior is the symptom. We're not really treating his behavior, or we ought not to be treating his behavior. We ought to be treating the root cause of his behavior, and the root cause of his behavior largely is fear. That's what hypervigilance, or the reason why people are hypervigilant is because they're fearful. They have to scan and be aware and overreact, and because at the heart of that, they're worried that something's going to happen to them. And so then that dovetails, and then I'll stop and see what people think, that it's unquestionable that Ryan does things that are worrisome and bothersome and annoying and hard to be around and all those kinds of things. And he's not the only kid at school. There's other kids around, so there's sometimes that worry about contingency effect. That it is also a universal truth around trauma that other people's trauma impacts us. And that one of the things, and again, Beth and I, in our work over the years, we've talked a lot about this, she and I and with her colleagues, that one of the things that we know about working with people that have been trauma exposed is that their behavior is at times going to violate your personal values and your professional values. And that's part and parcel of the work, that I am worried about workforces that are not prepared for the reality that your values are going to be violated. And if one of the important values in your life is respect, then you can guarantee that your respect value is going to be violated by somebody that's been trauma exposed, especially trauma exposed people that tend to externalize that. There's also internalizing kids that don't violate. But the internalizing kids sometimes put their heads down on the desk all the time. And sometimes teachers are like, you're not buying what I'm selling here, and that I'm really invested in my lesson, and you keep tapping out. So even internalizing kids can rise the temperature of adults. So to me, when I hear trauma informed, the first place I go to is, in order to be trauma informed, you have got to have examined yourself. forget about how technically skilled you might be in working with kids. That to me, a precondition of being technically skilled with kids is that you've dealt with your own crap and your own reactivity. Because a kid like Ryan is going to push your buttons. And that's just inevitable. I'm not excusing that he does it, but it is inevitable that he's going to step over certain boundaries and he's going to violate certain of your values. And that if you haven't examined that and prepared yourself for that, and so one of the questions that we talk a lot about with people in the work that we do is, how prepared are you individually, and what have you done individually, and then collectively, what have organizations like school districts done to prepare you for the inevitability that your values can be violated? It's just not just by traumatized kids that are traumatized, but even typically developed kids can violate our values. So let me stop there because there's a few other things I want to say about what I might consider best practice in working with a wonderful and challenging kid like Ryan.
I feel the need to acknowledge too that I've noticed within families and systems a different kind of trauma. This like the macro, kind of the bigger macro, like that with the pandemic and sort of all that created for kiddos and families, a whole different, so many different layers of stressors. And I think there's a different kind of trauma that came from that, that's still this like aftermath. So I just culturally, the pandemic also is another layer of trauma for systems and families.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. I'm glad you said that. Yeah. Ruth, for you, anything percolating? Just curious about what you're thinking about so far.
No, I'm all in. Yeah, you're speaking my language.
And again, some people know this. It's my style to just call on people if we're not necessarily generating. Wanda, anything for you percolating? What's coursing through the bloodstream so far here Friday afternoon?
The only thing I was thinking when you just made the statement about behavior and having expectations and joining ourselves and what works with home and school is that he is starting to get older. And what happens when he gets out in the big world, or when we have to make a plan for that, and how do we bring them in as well? I'm concerned about that only because he's getting older, and if we're not providing it here, or are we? I guess that would be the question. How do we continue to provide services for him that are going to make him world ready?
Yeah, I think that's a huge question, particularly schools and families start arm wrestling around that, or wrestling with that issue by age 16 when you have to, right? You really have to be thinking about it. And I think it's wise, Wanda, that he just turned 15, right? A little while ago. That it's the smart money's on starting to talk about this now, as a team, what are, people know him really well. I wanted to add an ancillary to that notion of, if we don't have a workforce that is reflective, which is really what I was saying there, that if you're not doing this work for fully examined reasons, and if you haven't fully examined the values that are most important to you, then I can bet dollars to donuts, regardless of a kid's IQ, they're going to know what your triggers are. And they're going to provoke those, not because they're manipulative or because they're provocative. It's because it is in their survival interest to provoke you, to see whether you're going to be an adult like the adults were that harmed them. So in so many ways, Ryan still, even after very good care for a very long period of time relatively, he still is not consistently secure with other adults. Yeah, Heather, please.
So I'm thinking about what you said is that, and that it's really hard for you to be trauma informed when you haven't dealt with your own stuff.
Yes.
And I'm thinking about staffing. So can you teach it? Like how does that work when you have, like, all of us have stuff and we probably I know we all have triggers, and like, how do you deal with that?
What I'm not saying is that everybody's got to have it all together before they work with a
Okay.
kid that's exposed. I'm not saying that.
Okay.
What I am saying is that there has to be some discovery, self-discovery, and self-surveillance and self-interrogation around what kinds of kids and what kind of behaviors get me going.
Yep.
Like, what am I vulnerable to? It doesn't mean everybody has to go back or go into therapy. I think that part of the responsibility of any organization that is a child-serving organization is that we have structures in place where people can talk about those vulnerabilities with their colleagues, because the greatest safeguard that my stuff doesn't play out on Amanda's kid is if I'm talking about some of that with Heather and with Beth and with
Yep.
Ruth. So there's some collective kind of acceptance that we all have unfinished business. We all have certain kinds of kids and certain behaviors. Like, again, the example that I use a lot is defiance does not register for me. Like, a kid can tell me I'm not freaking doing that, and even disrespect. A kid can say F you, Dave, or Mr. Melnick. It doesn't register. It doesn't mean I don't like it. It doesn't register for me. But it does for other people.
Yeah.
And vice versa. There are certain kinds of kids that when they start doing that thing that kid does, it drives me bonkers, and I know that I have vulnerabilities. If I don't say that out loud to my colleagues, then that is unjust, inequitable for kids. That if there isn't another adult that's co-holding my vulnerabilities, so that's what I'm talking about. It's just
Okay, that makes sense.
human
Thank you.
element of, we all have Achilles heels and we all have kryptonite when it comes to, we don't all work equally well with all kids and all behaviors. There are some people in your workforce that the moment a kid says, no, I'm not freaking doing that, they get anxious. And there are other people on your workforce that the moment the kid says, I'm not freaking doing that, they say, oh gosh, we got to figure this out together. They don't get anxious at all.
Mm-hmm.
The anxious ones are probably not having the same outcomes. And they're probably at times co-dysregulating the kid because of their own, and that's really what I'm saying, is just, are we aware of that?
Yep. Makes sense.
I think, and everybody that I talked to said this about Ryan, is that he might have a certain IQ that causes people to be like, oh yikes, he's got cognitive challenges. I haven't met a kid with low IQ that doesn't have islands of incredible competence, including Ryan. Cognitive competence, like he reads people, certain things about people. And Ruth, you told me this. Amanda, you told me this.
2 seconds flat.
Amanda, like I talked to, was like, he's got these skills that sometimes you'd say, I'm not sure he's got a 55 IQ with what he just did and what he just put together, right? So that's important to just keep in mind. And so I think partially, Heather, in answering your question, one of the slogans that often gets used in the trauma-informed world is we want adults around kids that are thermostats and not thermometers. And I think a brilliant and elegant, it's not mine, but the idea of thermostat, like we want to set the temperature and hope that that's the temperature that the kid can adjust to. If we're the thermometer, then it means that if he's running hot, so are we. And I think people were honest enough to say that can happen at Grey House. That sometimes when his temperature shoots up to 107.9, the person most responsible for co-regulating him is at 106.9. You can't co-regulate when you're burning up like that. So on the one hand, all of us are going to burn at times. And on the other hand, we've got to just name and acknowledge and then try to remediate, because that is, to go back to Heather's question, that is a solvable problem. So other thoughts before I move along a little bit? I'm just kidding.
I will say that is easier said than done.
Yeah, tell me about that. Say a little bit more about that.
Well, I think that everyone means well. Everyone wants to do what's right. And I truly believe that people are doing the best that they can. at that point in time, and have and it can be hard for people to be introspective. I'm kind of losing my train of thought at this point, actually.
I have an answer, Ruth. I know it's late in the week and you're dealing with kids. I mean, I have an answer to the partial question, and I think some of it is about what structures are in place in programs, in schools, in departments, in grade levels for the workforce to do some of that work, because I know we get caught up into the meetings that we have. We got to talk about the kids. We got 90 minutes. We're going to talk about 7 kids. I think that's an inefficient way for us to get better at our jobs, is to excessively and routinely just talk about kids. I think that we need to carve out existing time for people to reflect on, oh, look at me, Ryan did this and I'm getting upset. If I get upset, I have now minimized my capacity to be helpful to him. How can I sort out so the next time he makes that noise, I'm not getting as reactive? Because I think the temptation is to think about this as interventions towards the kid. And what, at least the trauma transforming work that I do, is it really challenges the first thing that we want our workforce to think about is not what strategy do I use with the kid, what do I do to get me back down to 98.6? But that's not what most of our meetings are about. Most of our meetings are about strategies, interventions, coping skills for the kid. And to me, it's putting the cart before the horse. And when it doesn't work, we just do more of it. Instead of, again, having a place where the IA could say, gosh, I noticed that when he does this, I'm fine, but when he does that, I get like this. How do we then support you to not get like this when he makes that noise or he stims in that way? If I were to further some of these themes, another theme that's kind of a standard trauma treatment theme is small world. He's not a kid, and you guys know that he's not a kid that can interface with a lot of adults. You need, 3 or 4 people in a school building that really speaks his language. And so when he goes to see Wanda has a psychological, at least, tell me if I'm putting words in your mouth, you have like a psychological first aid. You're not his counselor then, you're his nurse, and you're going to do what you do with any other kid. You're going to patch him back up. You're not going to get to the root cause, that maybe is in counseling or with mom. That you're going to try to co-regulate him, dust him off. Time to go back. Let's get back, get some work done. Is that fair, Wanda? So small world. If people that don't know how to speak Ryan's language has too much interaction with him, I worry that they're going to unnecessarily and unintentionally at times blow things up, and we don't want that to happen. Yeah, go ahead, Catherine.
So I'm just trying to summarize. You said that there was like 5 to 7 general practice guidelines.
Yes.
I got a couple, and then I was following the conversation, which was helpful, but I'm not sure if I pulled out what the other specific themed guidelines.
It would be alignment between adults.
Yep.
It would be small world. Creating a small world, which you have done. I think that's accomplished. Some of these have been accomplished. A recognition that trauma symptoms can infiltrate the system, the larger system, and we can't have a trauma reactive system that looks symptomatically the same way a traumatized person could look. I think sometimes, again, the honest conversation is sometimes people at Gray House can be as reactive as Ryan could be, or similarly, and that doesn't mean it's an incompetent staff. It means they're human. That's part of the challenge of doing trauma work in a school. I said that it's important as a general theme to identify your core values and to identify behaviors that you believe that you are vulnerable to have big reactions to, and we all have those. And I haven't met somebody that works equally well with all kinds of kids. Everybody has an LECL, so that was another one. And then, an ancillary or a correlate to that is, if we all have kryptonite and Achilles heel, then let's just be honest with each other. The kid knows it. Whether the kid has a 55 IQ or 125 IQ, they know it. It's in their interest to know it. They have to know it for survival reasons. They have to know what gets adults going. And Amanda, how many times did he test you to figure out that you weren't going to reject him, you weren't going to send him back, you weren't going to be another foster home that it didn't work out with? Like, how many scores, if not hundreds, if not thousands of times did you have to pass his test?
Years. It was years.
Yeah. Yep. Another core thing is, we want to be thermostats and not thermometers. If you're going to be the thermometer, that's an okay thing to do if you're clear that that's what you're doing, because sometimes being a thermometer for somebody else helps you empathize. It's like, oh gosh, if you feel if your temperature rises and you can feel the feelings and the experiences of somebody else, if you're intentional about that, I think that's a great skill to have. That's in some ways a way of thinking about empathy. Empathy is not simply knowing what somebody else feels. Empathy is feeling it, is having a reference point of, if a kid is sad, you will never be legitimate with a sad kid if you say, gosh, that sounds really sad, right? If there's a flatness in your voice, the kid's going to be like, you have no idea what sadness is like. But if you say, oh my gosh, that sounds really awful, what happened to your uncle? There has to be a texture and a tone in the voice that is some sense of your sadness is affecting me, right? That's what empathy is, at least my understanding of empathy. Does that work, Catherine? Is that
Perfect. Thank you. Good summation.
And then some of the things I'd add, again, let me just pause for a second. Beth, anything circulating that you're willing to share?
No, I think you're spot on. And I keep going back to what Wanda said, is how can we get him prepared, because we can't keep his world small forever. And the root cause of his behavior is fear. Within a school system, I feel like, I'm not sure where to go with it. With that
Well,
root cause.
Okay. I was a little bit too reductionist to say fear is the only epicenter of
Right.
kids. It would also be anger. And
Okay.
the anger that he has in a moment is sometimes the anger that you've said no to him. But sometimes his anger morphs into rage. And the primary difference between anger and rage is anger is in the moment, rage is historical. So sometimes when you say no to him, it is representative of all the things he didn't get. And so he has this big reaction. You're like, why are you having such a big reaction? He just said, no, you can't have seconds on this. Like, it's disproportionate. To him, if you're seeing rage, it's important to recognize that anger is a very intelligent emotion, and we all have it, and we all need to use it. Rage is often the language of the voiceless. So when he becomes enraged, he time travels. He's expressing things that he couldn't express 0 to 4, when it probably wasn't as safe to express that. So rage is really about historical. And even though the school didn't hurt him when he was 0 to 4, he time travels like most traumatized kids who are traumatized. He time travels, especially when you say no to him, and especially when you set limits on him. You already know Ruth gave me all the traditional triggers for kids, they're very clear about the things that are likely to evoke a response from him. So if I were to kind of go through this, trauma is a physiological condition. It's a central nervous experience, fundamentally, and then relational. There is no question, and I think that Amanda has fixed some of this. There's no question that kids coming out of 4-year prolonged extensive trauma exposure in the ways that he was, that they're going to have attachment problems. He has attachment problems, right? I mean, you're not going to be unscathed in terms of your sense about, and attachment is a lot of things, but it's fundamentally about security. And it's fundamentally about, can I predict that this person in front of me is going to hurt me, harm me, or help me. And I think Ryan is constantly having to decide, are you going to harm me or are you going to help me? And I don't think it's always clear to him. I think like lots of kids that are exposed to trauma, he misinterprets discipline. I think he still believes that discipline is something that adults do to hurt kids, not that discipline is something that adults do to teach kids. He misinterprets it. And there are scores of kids in Mount Abe that misinterpret discipline for some of the very same reasons. They think when adults say no, you can't, or they have a consequence, they think it's personal, they think it's designed to hurt them, not designed. And we know that discipline is just something we adults do to teach kids. We're teaching values in discipline. That's what discipline is. It's teaching values. You do this in this situation, you don't do that. Yes, you can yell when you're at a hockey game. No, you can't yell when you're in the classroom. So given that he's got, it looks like Shannon's joining, given that we know that he's got some attachment, he's insecure, hi Shannon, that we know that he has some insecurities, we know that he has extremely delayed self-regulation skills, and that Amanda described to me, like the parents that are doing a really good job with a kid with his challenges, Amanda must co-regulate 77 times a day or more, as you do at school. That at least for the foreseeable future, Ryan is going to depend on environmental and co-regulatory. He is not yet developmentally able to self-regulate consistently. He has some self-regulation skills, unquestionably. He has developed some self-regulation skills. But when his stress mounts at all, he almost becomes completely dependent externally on you, which again makes his IA the most important person at school. I know special educators, his most important person at school, and if the model stays the same into the future, his most important person is going to be the IA and Ruth. Because they're going to be so responsible for consistent co-regulation. And it's important for anybody working with him that many hours a day to understand that co-regulation isn't something that you teach, it's something you experience. You don't teach your 2-year-old how to calm down, you co-experience it with them. Let's say 1-year-old. You got your 1-year-old, you say, sweetie, mommy's here. I know you're really hungry. Co-regulation is an experiential thing, not a do this, Ryan. That's self-regulation. He's often not capable of. He will be completely dependent on how well regulated the adults are around him. One of the great things about Ryan, which is often not the case with kids with attachment challenges, is he does a pretty good job signaling his distress. Like, you don't have to guess. Some kids you gotta guess, right? Some kids can smile and then 10 minutes later they just hit another kid and you're like, I didn't see that coming. He forecasts himself. Am I remembering that pretty well? I mean, you don't have to necessarily guess with him. He's pretty transparent. When he's upset, you know he's upset. So in the attachment world, we call that distress signaling. He's really good at that. And that's a really promising attachment sign, because it means to me, in some very fundamental way, he hasn't given up on adults. Because you folks in school, you work with kids that don't distress signal until it's too late. Partially because they've given up on adults. They don't signal us that they're even distressed because they don't even think we can help them. Art of attachment is also, and we talked about this a little bit, I used the word reenactment. Think about, in very fundamental ways, in some ways, regardless of Ryan's IQ, cognitive capacity, he will still push people as a test to see, are you going to do to me what was done to me? So a reenactment is when a human being pushes another human being to respond in a way that we're most familiar with. And reenactment works both ways. Healthy people reenact all the time. Healthy children and adolescents are constantly testing to see whether you're going to treat me as well as I'm used to being. So it goes both ways. If you have an abuse history, you're testing to see whether people are going to hurt you. And when you've had a really good, safe life, you reenact in the sense of you just expect that that teacher is going to treat you with great respect because that's how you've been treated in your life. Does that make sense, folks? Is that... I think one of the greatest important things around being trauma informed, in addition to what I said about being reflective, maybe the second or third or fourth most important thing is the capacity to not take Ryan's behavior literally. Just literally. Of course, if you're worried about him hurting somebody, then take that literally. But oftentimes, the things that he's doing will lend themselves to different interpretations. Like Wanda and I talked about this, and again, challenge me on this because I'm not a school employee. If a kid elopes and they go towards a dangerous place, that's worrisome. If a kid elopes outside a classroom and goes to Wanda or Shannon or Jason, I would praise that. Because that is distress seeking. That's attachment seeking. Is the kid made an in the moment neurobiological decision? What I need right now is not here. I got to go find it. And instead of saying it's not safe to leave it, all the things that we might conventionally say if he's being unsafe, but it sounds like when he elopes, more often than not, he's got a destination. Am I remembering that right, Ruth? And so I would rather people talk to him about, oh my gosh, you didn't like what was going on in the classroom. You found yourself somebody that you thought would calm you down. Good on you. I would leave aside that he left supervision. That's a worry. But if I were to put him in a hierarchy, that's a significantly less worry now that he's not leaving to do something dangerous. And the thing that I want to reinforce with him is we want our children and adolescents to go safety seeking, whether it's their peers are doing something and they go home to mom and dad and they say, my friends are doing stuff. And that to me is we teach kids to seek out safety when where they're currently at is not providing that. So thoughts about that? Any of that so far? So I don't want to mount up too much without. Yeah, Ruth, please.
For sure, there are times where he has left somewhere and gone and sought out Wanda. But just for the record, that isn't always. It's sometimes to obtain something that he wants to obtain. Like just yesterday, heading back to the building so that he could try to do some skating with his socks on around the gym.
Yeah. Right, so what are people saying to him? To me, what I'm really trying to point out is what's the first message that he gets? If the first message is some version of naughty, he internalizes that his self-esteem is not yet to the place where I think he can discern the life lesson versus a sense of, oh, you really wanted to do something that is more enjoyable than what I was asking you to do. It doesn't mean that we don't go back to a corrective conversation. It just means to me is how attuned are we to the first and second thing that we say when we come upon him. And challenge, if that feels like, that doesn't match up with how we do things here at Mount Abe, then I'm hoping that I could be wrong about that.
I do think that we do a lot of co-regulating with him. I do think that we do meet him where he's at. And I also know, as you said, people are human, and there are triggers that we all have, and that can get the better of us sometimes. But I do think that as a whole, we are meeting Ryan where he is.
Just so I can make sure that I'm integrating that as much as I can into what I'm writing. what are some examples of like the best practice stuff that you hear from
Can I just-
yourself, from your,
Can I just, for 1 second, the battery on this computer is going to die. So I'm going to sign in on another computer.
okay.
Okay? So, anyways.
You want us to hold for a sec, Amanda?
Yeah, just give me a minute. Perfect. Thank you. Let me get out of here this one. Okay. Okay.
There you go.
Sorry.
Yeah, go ahead, Ruth. Again, I don't want to put you on the spot, but I want to get a flavor of some of the.
Could you repeat the question, babe?
So the question was, like, you got some like top of mind on a Friday afternoon examples of like, here's where we're really firing with all cylinders. He does this and we say that. Like, what would be some examples of? Just because people don't always agree with what best practice is, I'm assuming, and we talked about some of this, but I want to make sure that we're agreeing on what best practice would be when he's making concerning decisions.
Boy, let's see. He might say something like, I'm going to have my snack at 2:00. And we might say, oh, 2:00 is when you have your snack. And then he might say something like, and nobody's gonna stop me from having that snack. And I might say, oh, sounds like you're really concerned that you're gonna be really hungry. Yeah. And I'm gonna eat it, and I don't care what anybody says. Like,
How can I help? How can I help you? What you just said to me is gold standard. And then what comes from there? That to me, what you just described would be, in my view, kind of gold standard response.
I might say, what were you thinking of for your snack? What were you envisioning? What did you want to eat? And he might say, I'm gonna have that frozen fruit thing in the freezer. Like, awesome. That sounds like a great snack to have. There's also peanut butter and crackers. You could have those too, if you want them. And it depends on the day and whether he will continue to perseverate on it, or whether I'm able to redirect by saying, hey, right, it's 1:30 right now. Let's continue to talk about let's keep working on the clock, or let's go for a walk.
Yeah, great. Yeah, thank you, Heather. Go ahead, please.
Is ignoring ever an appropriate response?
I think so. But I get worried about the indiscriminate use of ignoring. That's more
Sure.
about the adults either not knowing what to say, or the adult is doing that more to regulate themselves. And so I think that's fine, like selectively. I also think it's fine to switch from the food to the worry. I also think it's fine to have a sticky note on his desk. Maybe you guys do this. That's kind of like that notion of like you're worried about food. Can we just write that down so we know that I know you're worried and you know you're worried, so we can externalize the worry? The OT, I read the OT report. I thought the OT had some really clever ideas around addressing some of these things. So I think, Ruth, what you just described to me is, and I would wonder then, and I know this might be a heavier lift for him, can he, once he's at a later time, say, hey, I know that you get worried about food, and when you get worried about food, I get really sad for you, because will he accept that kind of, will he receive that kind of empathy?
Yeah, he does. And if I make complete eye contact with him and say something like, Wow, Ryan, that sounds like you're feeling really upset about whatever. He will lock into my eyes and he is all in.
Yeah. And if you asked him a question at that point, one of the points that the OT made in the graph that she showed is this kind of hierarchy of, access. And sometimes we adults talk too much, and I'm guilty of that a lot. And that it really reminded me around visual cues, whether he's on the spectrum or not. That turning to that. But would he answer a question in the scenario that you're painting? If you said, oh gosh, can I tell you what I'm thinking right now? Would he be curious enough to say, what, Ruth, what is it?
It depends on how escalated he is before we get to that point.
Yeah.
If I have caught him or we have caught him early enough to, set that thermometer, as you said, and not rise with him, then yes, he will be able to pause and be inquisitive. But if we have passed that point, it's more difficult to get him to co-regulate with him.
Yeah. And if you started walking away from him, not in a dismissive way, but if you started walking away from him and just saying, come on, we need to move our bodies, will he 6 out of 10 times do that? 8 out of 10 times? 2 out of 10 times?
No, I would not say that. First of all, Rye has a really hard time being by himself. So even in this building, if he is, I've set him up with his snack, and I say, Rye, I have to just go into my office to get something. His anxiety starts to spike, and he'll.
Go with you just so you could get his body moving a little bit and make it more nonverbal than the verbal. Because I hear you that there's a threshold that he gets to a certain place where verbal expression is just going to escalate, and you got to. But would he be curious enough to say, would you come with me? You and I, we need to go. Like, I would never promote, you need to take a break, because he's not capable of that. We need to go take care of ourselves. If you used we language with him and movement was incorporated, would 6 out of 10 times he walk to the other side of the building, the other side of the house with you?
If I were to do that with him,
Yes.
and say we need to go, he probably 6 out of 10 times, I think he probably would do that.
And if you said, like, I'm really worried about us. And again, I personally in my work am very sensitive to language, even though I know the more distressed he gets, the less he's listening to the content part of language. I still have a lot of faith in framing things in the we and not the you. And again, I don't know how much that you need to. I don't get the sense that that's your style, Ruth, but I don't know, Sheila, if that's her style of more declarative statements to him about what he needs to do.
Yeah, I think that is definitely something that we could work on.
Yeah. So I would shift the language, and I would try to convince Sheila that declarative things, particularly when his temperature's rising, are probably only going to be evocative for him. They're only likely to cause more stress and strain. And that the we language really communicates, hey kid, we're in this together. We're really starting to get upset about this food thing. We got to figure this out. It doesn't centralize him as the problem. It's us, and it keeps it feeling really collaborative.
That's very helpful, and I will spread that news, that
Yeah.
idea.
And again, I would personally stay away from declarative. You need to. I know that's language that's often used with kids, especially kids with emotional disturbance. Like, you need to do this now, as if we're trying to help them. But I think the language makes a difference. I think the choice. You can walk with me. You could walk with Sheila. What would be better for you right now? Making sure that we're incorporating choice. The more upset he is, the more important autonomy and agency is. And he's already demonstrated to you, if you don't give me choice, I'm just going to take it anyway. I'm going to do what I want to do. I'm going to go to the gym and skate around in my socks, because that's what I feel like I want to do right now. Amanda, thoughts before I advance a little bit?
No, just everything that you're saying makes perfect sense.
All right, let me see if I can say something controversial. Get people whipped up here in the last half hour. I think a lot of again, I think there's a lot of good hard work being done. Let's talk a little bit about suggestions and shifts. Are there certain things as a team that you wanted to do but you haven't yet done? Like before I say here's what I might, there's certain things that have been on your wish list to support, encourage, challenge, Ryan, that you haven't got to yet? Or I wonder if this might be helpful.
Really great question. And it's one that I have been really grappling with this year, of trying to figure out what is best for Ryan. What programming is best for Ryan? What does he really need to grow? And I don't know if that's the direction, if that was your question.
Yeah. Well, and I should ask it more specifically too. Like, is there a certain behavior that is particularly head scratching for folks today at school?
First of all, today he had a really good day. What I am starting to wonder is he had a very good day, and it was a very different day. And I'm wondering whether he does better when novelty is being thrown at him. I was just a wonder today, because the schedule was very different. We had a evacuation drill in the morning. He is very, very fixated on wanting to earn a full page spread of Courage the Cowardly Dog. And he said to me this morning, I'm going to be nice so I can get that picture. And it's like, you go, Ryan, you're doing a great job. And he was very helpful. He went out of his way to say something kind to a young woman who was on crutches. Are you okay? And he thoroughly knew what he was doing. He was rocking it. So so we had that, and then we had a visit from the superintendent with his Great Dane puppy, and he sat with the Great Dane puppy and said, I love dogs, and did you know that, Sheila, that I love dogs? And so that went really well. He and I did testing today, because I have to get him through the multi-state alternative assessment. So we did that, which was totally different. And he did a lot of stimming while he was doing it, and I just kept, encouraging him, saying, you can take a break anytime. And he said, no, I'm good. And
there's been some explanation, Tim, because that was a question I talked with a psychiatrist about today, because there's been a real pendulum swing in the last 10, 20 years around stimming, and what the way I was trained 20 or 30 years ago is very different in the last 10 years. I think what you just said, Ruth, is much more aligned with the today knowledge, is seeing stimming as a expression of stress and not something that should be extinguished, that we want to talk with kids about, oh gosh, when you do that, I wonder if that's your body's way of telling me that you're worried, or that you're scared, or that you're upset. It sounds like that's more the approach with stimming.
Yeah, well, that was the approach that I was using today with him in testing, and surprised that he wasn't saying, yeah, can I take a break? Like, yeah. You really can. You don't have to keep going. And then we had, we went for a long walk with a friend, and
so any behavior that's particularly, and it's been a few weeks since I talked to you, so I don't want to, anything that's particularly perplexing, of like, oh gosh, for the rest of the school year, we really need to support and work on this?
Well, it's interesting. What I am noticing with him is that the really, the behaviors such as incredible, strong rage, that is lessening. Self-harm has definitely, that has lessened. What we are experiencing is what you referred to as annoying behavior, and such as laughing sort of maniacally at times. Sheila's so funny, or somebody else is so funny. He does seem to have an issue with flatulence, and he see you smiling there, Amanda. We're trying to help him understand that it's not a law that you can't pass gas in front of people, but that others don't find it appealing. And
Bertha, let me pause for a second, because you're just identifying something that I think is one of the core treatment principles that I forgot to say, that I think you're bringing up, and it is a variation of the notion of aligned adults. With typically developed kids, or even kids that have other kinds of emotional challenges, I think stylistic differences between adults and language difference amongst adults can be really helpful. I think with Ryan, the more there's alignment in why in the autism world, I think it's still generally accepted that universal language across domains is in benefit to the kid. So it would be really important to know that whatever language Amanda's using that's successful is the language that's used at school, and conversely, the language that people are using at school that you find to be successful, that's shared with home. That level of consistency and universality is extremely important for the multiple different challenges and frameworks that we talked about: developmental, autism potentially, and trauma. So is there some universality around the language? In the autism world, they use things like "that was an unexpected behavior," or "what do you think I'm thinking right now about you passing gas?" Like some theory of mind training, social scripting. Rock brain is another term that's used, like when a kid's really stuck. So is there enough consistency amongst the different domains of his life where we're helping him by being really aligned with the language?
I think we have tried so many different ways of communicating that, and some people are triggered by that more than others, so that can be challenging, but we've done everything from saying things like, Ryan, do you need to go use the bathroom right now? Or we have tried saying, well, that was that was unexpected, or thank you for saying excuse me, or yes, we are outside, this is a much more appropriate place to pass gas.
Yeah.
They're all different approaches, but I think that because we have not found, and this is just like one little area, that we don't find the magic there's like the magic phrase.
Yeah.
And is there a magic phrase to all these different?
No, I would think about.
So,
I really like the
Dave,
examples,
can I make
but
a comment? Can I answer that question?
Yes, please.
In response to your question, as far as language and procedures and things being the same at home and at school and being able to work that out, that has been a huge difficulty this year. And none of this flatulence conversation, for example, has even been discussed with me or talked with me about. So it's been really difficult to sync up the language between home and school because we have a communication problem.
And you would have some helpful ideas around that. You have some language ideas. I mean, I watched you with him. You'd have some language ideas that you might suggest.
Yeah, I have procedures that we use at home and things that we talk about at home, yeah.
And I don't want to pretend that everything that he does is going to have to be codified and universalized.
Right.
I'm just thinking about what are the 3 or 4 most worrisome things. And I'm particularly interested in universal language when tension is rising, which it has to. You can't give him a tense, stress-free life. It's not realistic.
Okay.
So I'm particularly interested at the intersection of, as you're having to correct him, what are the things that are generally agreed upon between homeschool community that we can do a better job integrating? And not everything. It's unrealistic to think that every positive.
Oh, right, exactly.
Right, but what are the 3 or 4 things as his temperature is rising that we want to make sure? And it could be like, again, my sense with a kid that has some IQ challenges, I have a little bit more leeway with the tone of my voice than I would with a typically developed 15-year-old. Like I might be like, uh-oh, we're in a tough spot here. Like even just some scripted things that are just playful but puts everybody on alert that this doesn't feel right to us. Uh-oh, there's that sound again when he's passing gas. Like something that, because I'm worried about, like, again, his temperature is going to rise a little bit anytime you set a limit or put an expectation that doesn't match what he's thinking in the moment. But is there enough overlap between what you would say and what Ruth's saying or what Sheila's saying, that at those critical moments where he's either going to take a left turn and it's going to be a problem, or he's going to take a right turn and he's going to be right back to where we want him to be. So more conversation around that. So if I were to go in the last bit of time that we have, I think it won't be any surprise, like the treatment plan that I'm recommending, again, it's not starting from scratch. There's a lot of things that are going on. Parent to professional alignment. If there has to be some mediation on that, then mediation, within the building, whether that's a Steve, Alexander, that it is such a critical thing that I would invest in that. I see no reason, and I would tell you if I did, I see no reason why there can't be more in syncness than there might currently be. I think people are reasonable and thoughtful and caring, and that I think part of what people are dealing with in the tension is somewhat universal in these circumstances. Second thing I would say is absolutely structure and routine, that he is not, in answering Wanda's initial, at 15, he is nowhere near being able to self-regulate on any consistent basis for the foreseeable future. Structuring his environment with lots of routine and structure, excessively rigid structure at times. The third thing I'd say is that it does matter to me as a treatment provider if he's on the spectrum or not. Because of some access issues and because of some tinkering in treatment planning, the environment, because the environment is so critical, what we just talked about, universal language as much as possible. Training for all staff, and not training to be better at working with Ryan. That's secondary. The primary training to me is, do I know what buttons I have? Because a kid with a trauma history is going to see my buttons in a gigantic way. They're going to see it in a crystal clear way because they have to. So to me, it's far more, before we talk about interventions and strategies for a kid, it's how are we structuring some of our adult time to really do some of the work of talking about what behaviors am I vulnerable to? When do I get tongue-tied? Because most of us get tongue-tied with certain kinds of kids and not with other kinds of kids. Catherine, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I just I know some of the consults I've done with you with Lunds through the consortium, there's like a follow-up, so many follow-ups that you can provide on these specific evals. Is that true for when schools
Up to the school. It's more of it's a funding thing, but it's up to the school. So I'm fine meeting with the team, even if there's not funding. And once you read the report, I would meet with the team again for an hour. But it usually is based on the funder's decision around that.
Because I think this is a really helpful conversation, just sort of anecdotally kind of trying to lay it out, those initial 4 to 5 things to focus on. This is really rich discussion.
I would,
very specific, situations that link the thread between home and school across these environments. So I'm just, I'm going to have to pop off just before 4:30 for another
Yes.
meeting, jump into another.
but I do want to say, maybe before you jump off, that part of the environment and how we as adults, part of what I've tried to say, but not so clearly, is we're the most critical part of the environment. That's not the case for 15-year-olds. Other 15-year-olds are the most important part of their environment. It doesn't mean that we adults aren't important and parents aren't important, because we are. But right now and for the foreseeable future, we are the critical element of Ryan's environment. We are 80% of his environment. And that means that the way that we're seeing his naughtiness, word I used before, is I think it's really important for people to understand that these behaviors that he does that are maybe annoyance-based behaviors, that how we frame those, how we understand those, are going to determine our tone of voice and the words we choose and to address those. And that as of now, he has minimal control over those. That those are almost always his distress signals. So when he's stimming, he's in distress. When he's saying repeated words over and over again, he's distressed. When he's passing gas after he's been cued not to, probably overstimulation is a kind of stress, right? So he might be overstimulated because he thinks the kids are laughing at him and he likes a little bit of that. So I would ask people to consider that his inappropriate behaviors are much more accurately described as distress signals. And that if we see him as distress signals, in some ways, I like playing with words, because if we see him as distress signals, we're less likely to get our own values violated, which is one of the first things we talked about today. Is if he's doing something that violates your values, it's going to be hard to regulate your own temperature. But if you see that what he's doing is a desperate distress signal, part of seeing it that way and languaging it that way is actually intended to regulate us adults. Not to let the kid off the hook, but to at least ensure that the first and second interaction that we're having is not being overly influenced on how fed up we are with what the kid is doing. Because if we're fed up, we're communicating that.
Dave, are you going to have a report, or is the report, you're going to have a report to the school?
Yeah.
Will that be shared with this team, Beth?
Yeah.
Or
Yep, I'll send it.
And in the report, is there going to be references to resources, for these, strategies?
Some is like, I'm a conduit of all these things I've heard from other people, so I will put as many in there as I can. And that some of this is, some of what ongoing consultation. The OT, I don't always read good OT reports. That was a good OT report. I mean, I thought that was really helpful.
Bailey's amazing.
Yeah. So, I mean, I would lean heavily, because OTs often have language and thoughts that I'm just not trained in.
And I was just going to say earlier, I felt like some of these things you were touching on brought me back to some of the Bruce Perry, the three R's, regulate, relate, reason, and in that order. So, when we, come, like him running around in the gym, or your first contact with him after an incident, sort of how it played out. Yeah.
I'll incorporate some of that. I didn't show stress slides here because many of you have expertise. Beth has seen it 1,000 times. There's a lot of expertise, Shannon, 1,000+ times too. So you have people here that have expertise in that. But I will review that. I will also want to add the role of counseling. That one as an outside. That the role of counseling to me could be critical in both alignment, helping with alignment between the adults on the team, and also, I mean, he's not going to be able to generalize a lot of what he talks about. He's going to need help to be able to remember and put into practice anything that he's talked about with any counselor. But I think one role of a counselor in this context would be alignment of the adults. And I think another is universal language, is making suggestions around the kind of language that is going to be most helpful to the entire team and ultimately.
And when you touched on the empathy pieces, that made me think of Dan Hughes with the PACE model. Yeah.
But again, there's so much expertise on this team. I just I would really make sure that you're leaning heavily on the wisdom that is embodied within everybody here. Final thoughts. So yes, counseling's great for those reasons. The environment is important for the reasons that I stated. The elements that I described at the beginning would be the core elements of a school program. You know, what happens at home. His life is pretty structured at home. He's supervised all the time at home like he is at school.
I'm just curious. I'm going to hop off here, but I wanted to ask the school team, because I know we have these meetings, you know, that we had set up. So I just, do we have another meeting lined up? I'm just curious.
Just pop into my calendar.
Yeah,
But
we
Beth,
have,
go ahead if you know.
we have an IEP meeting coming up next week, April 8th. the week
Okay.
after. Yeah. That's
I
next
might,
week.
okay, I think I might miss that one.
Okay.
We'll see. April 8th, what time? Okay, yeah, I've got like packed meetings on the 8th, so I'll miss that. But whenever we have another regular meeting, I'm just curious. I do suggest accessing follow-up consult with Dave, with this team, to do a little more of this as we're trying to integrate the recommendations of the report into his treatment. All right, thank you. Good to see you, Dave.
Thanks, Catherine.
Have a nice weekend, everybody.
Thank you.
Yeah, I need to let Beth and Ruth know that Ryan is going to be attending CVU next year. So what we are going to be looking at this point really is what we are going to do to finish out the year and how we can make this a good time for him. I will be telling him that this evening. I haven't told him yet, but I just wanted the team to know. Beth, I know that you're going to be seeing Jess in a week or so, and I told Jess that Jess and I have already had some conversations. So,
Who's Jess?
Jessica is the Special Services Director at CBU.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's big news. I mean, in my mind, it doesn't. For me, it doesn't change anything in terms of what I'm going to write.
Nope, not at all.
Writing, you know, that.
We still have 3 months that we need to figure this out, and setting him up in these next 3 months with whatever the transition is going to be is only going to strengthen how he responds to everything and everyone.
How do you suspect he'll respond when he goes back to school with that information? Do you have just a guess?
I am not sure. I think that I don't know. And I think that's something that hopefully, Ruth, you can just give me some feedback on. I am going to tell him because I want him to start thinking about it and processing it. But I'm going to frame it in a way that, you know, he needs to stay focused on right now, and he needs to stay focused on what's happening and how he's going to transition through the next 3 months.
Amanda, is he going through school choice, or are you moving? And I ask because if he's going through school choice, you probably can start inviting the CVU team to some of our meetings. But if he's not going through school choice, he has to be registered there before we can talk.
He is actually going to be coming to school on a voucher.
Okay.
And registration will happen next Monday. They had SATs, or Tuesday. They had SATs today, so I wasn't able to do that. But
Okay, so we can start pulling that team in if
Yes.
that makes sense to
yeah,
you.
and
Okay, great.
Jess will be the contact for that at this point because they don't
Okay.
have, you know, anybody else in line until Jess sort of figures out where that's going. So
Awesome. Okay.
Amanda, can you let us know how it goes this weekend so
Sure.
that we have an idea, you know,
Sure.
possibly what to expect? And I had a question too, like, do you think he'll fully understand what it means, or do you think it will take some
He will.
processing?
He absolutely understands what it means because it's been a conversation that we have had. There have been last fall he was able to attend some events here with some of the other special service students, and you know we had a whole conversation about because he asked about going to school here, and we had a conversation about that. And I said, I didn't know, that we don't know for sure, but, you know, trying to get his feeling on what he thought about that. So,
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for letting everybody know. Is that any final thing before we end the meeting? Okay, thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Dave. I look forward to the report. Thank you so much.
Yeah, take me a few weeks, maybe right after April break, it'll get it there. But I'll send it. And Beth, I'll send it directly to you with multiple copies and leave it up. The school is the hiring agent, so then you decide how you.
Perfect. Yeah, I look forward to it. Thank you.
Very quickly, Amanda, I'm going to be doing I don't think I mentioned it, the NMT, the Bruce Perry neurosequential model, brain map. People are calling. Is that okay with you?
yes.
If that, okay. And I can talk to you about it once you see it. You know.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
it's pretty decodable, but I'm glad to talk to you. I really completed it.
Yeah.
All right.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Everybody.
Thank you.
Time.
Thank you.